Welcome to Why I Vaccinate, presented by the Franny Strong Foundation and the Michigan Department of Health and Human Services. I'm Ann Thomas, and I am here with my co host, Veronica McNally. And Veronica, on today's show, we are going to be talking about building community immunity. So we want to welcome our first guest, Annette Mercatante, Medical Health Officer with the St. Clair County Health Department. Welcome to the show, Annette.
Well, thank you.
And I want to start out by congratulating both you and Veronica. You are Michigan's newest hometown health heroes, and this award was presented to both of you by the Michigan Public Health Week Consortium. So, congratulations. I'm with two wonderful health experts.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Veronica, why don't you start out? I know you want to kind of talk a little bit to Annette about what exactly is community immunity.
Yeah, Annette, go ahead, share that definition with us. We've been hearing so much about it because of the pandemic.
Yeah, so in layman's terms, that really just means that there is enough immune system response to a germ where that germ does not have an opportunity to widely spread. Much of it depends, the immunity level depends on how infectious that organism might be. So with highly infectious organisms, you need a very high level of immunity, and with lesser infectious organisms, lesser. But the bottom line is if there's if every individual has a immunity against a germ, typically a virus, or it can be a bacteria as well, that the germ doesn't have the opportunity to spread. And as a result, the entire community is then protected. If you will, it just kind of fizzles out. It's like it can't get burning and it can't get moving through. And so that's our goal. That has been a success in many of our vaccine preventable diseases, that we reach a point where the germs really don't spread like wildfire through a community, because there's these firewalls of people who have immunity and the germ can't replicate it and move on. And so that's our goal with COVID, of course, is that we want a situation where it doesn't spread like wildfire and kind of debilitate us the way it's been.
What does that community immunity concept do in terms of protecting our vulnerable populations?
Sure. So no vaccine is 100% effective, and there's always individuals who don't mount immune responses, either by vaccine or even by natural infection. So again, if you have a large amount of resistance against a virus or a germ replicating, then the entire community is protected, because it just can't move on. Germs generally need human bodies, susceptible human bodies, to replicate and then move on to the next person. And so if it reaches a person that it can't replicate, kind of dies out. And so a strongly immune community will protect everyone, even those who aren't immune. And that's the beauty of vaccine-induced immunity, is you don't have to wait for everybody to get infected in order to reach that level. And infections generally don't help us reach that level, because infections cause a lot of illness, and it causes problems, disease, which is not what we want. We don't want everyone to get really sick first to get that immune level. We want people to be stronger before we have so much input.
What are some myths around this concept of community immunity? And maybe I think it ties right into natural immunity. I think there's myths around natural immunity too.
Yeah. Well, first, I'd like to say that the whole concept of natural immunity is really misunderstood. Immunity that is achieved by vaccine is natural immunity. Okay. It is immunity that's achieved through a vaccine from our own natural immune system. So it's a misnomer when you say natural immunity. It's all natural immunity. 1.0 is based on getting infected and suffering the consequences of that infection and the disease, complications of illness and even death and hospitalizations, where a vaccine generally does not create illness, and therefore the immunity is easier to obtain. The other condition is, we talk about community-wide immunity. It's generally not achieved through infection. We don't see the widespread infections causing, achieving that level of immunity that we want for community protection that is always historically achieved through vaccination only. So that's the importance of a strong vaccination acceptance rate in a community when you're trying to eliminate widespread transmission.
I know Anne has some questions about this topic and some of the other work that you do.
Annette, as the medical health officer for the St. Clair County Health Department, what are you seeing with regard to how people view this out in the community? Do we need more education about community immunity?
It's a great question. Some of this is education. I think some of it, this has been a unique situation. Vaccines, of course, aren't new. Even the mRNA technology is not really new, but it's been perceived, this whole approach to COVID is perceived as kind of suspect, which is interesting. And I think that has more of an emotional, political component to it than really an ignorance component to it. I'm not using that word in a derogatory sense, but yeah, there is a point where you have to try and educate people, but there still seems to be an extraordinary amount of fear and distrust with this particular vaccine. So I do think education is important. Again, there's this concern that, well, why bother with a vaccine that I don't trust when I can just get infected with this virus and develop immunity? And I think the important thing people understand is our immunity from a natural infection is also appears not to be lasting for a very long time. That seems to be very clear with what we know already epidemiologically. So if you're going to rely on an infection to cause your immunity, you're really in no better place as far as those of us who are relying on vaccines and getting boosters. So that's number one. And number two is you're presenting yourself to getting really ill. And the long-term complications of COVID infections are still not well understood, but clearly are profound with long COVID symptoms, the cognitive impacts it seems to be having, the diabetic risk that seems to be creating. So the risk of getting a COVID infection really outweighs tremendously from the risk of getting a vaccine. And people don't realize that waiting to get an infection is just really a poor choice compared to the vaccine itself.
How do you help people who are still hesitant?
You know, we know that just telling them they're wrong is the wrong thing to do. You can't just say, no, you're wrong, you don't understand. I think it's really important to meet them where they're at, understanding what their concerns are, and more importantly, listening to their concerns very actively, making sure that you let them know that you understand what their concerns are, and trying to meet them where they're at. Some people may take a lot of work. Other people may just need to be reassured. And there's a lot of discussion. We talked about education, but educating our healthcare providers to do this kind of motivational interviewing approach where they're not just, when they find a vaccine hesitant patient, not to just tell them that they're wrong, but to really listen to what their concerns are very carefully and try to respond to those concerns very specifically and very compassionately, and making sure that they listen well.
Annette Mercatante, Medical Health Officer with the St. Clair County Health Department. Thank you for the time today. We really appreciate the advice.
Thank you for having me.
You are listening to Why I Vaccinate. We'll be back right after these messages.